Eyeglasses, additionally called glasses or scenes, focal points set in outlines for wearing before the eyes to help vision or to address such imperfections of vision as nearsightedness, hyperopia, and astigmatism. In 1268, Roger Bacon offered the soonest recorded remark on the utilization of focal points for optical purposes, yet amplifying focal points embedded in outlines were utilized for perusing both in Europe and China as of now, and it involves debate whether the West gained from the East or the other. In Europe, eyeglasses previously showed up in Italy, their acquaintance being credited with Alessandro di Spina of Florence. The main picture to show eyeglasses is that of Hugh of Provence by Tommaso da Modena, painted in 1352. In 1480, Domenico Ghirlandaio painted St. Jerome at a work area from which hung eyeglasses, thus, St. Jerome turned into the benefactor holy person of the Display Producers Society. The soonest glasses had raised focal points to help farsightedness. A sunken focal point for nearsightedness, or astigmatism, is first clear in the representation of Pope Leo X painted by Raphael in 1517. In 1784, Benjamin Franklin concocted bifocals, isolating his focal points for far off and close to vision, the split parts being held together by the casing. Solidified bifocals were developed in 1884, and the melded and one-piece types continued in 1908 and 1910, individually. Spectacles and new plans in bifocals were subsequently presented, including the Franklin bifocal restored in one-piece structure. Ernst Abbe and Otto Schott in 1885 exhibited that the fuse of new components into the glass liquefy prompted numerous beneficial varieties in refractive file and dispersive force. In the cutting-edge measure, glass for focal points is first moved into plate structure. Most focal points are produced using clear crown glass of refractive list 1. 523. In high nearsighted redresses, a corrective improvement is effected if the focal points are made of thick rock glass, refractive file 1. 69, and covered with a film of magnesium fluoride to invalidate the surface reflections. Stone glass, or barium crown, which has less dispersive force, is utilized in melded bifocals. Plastic focal points have gotten progressively famous, especially if the heaviness of the focal points is an issue, and plastic focal points are more shatterproof than glass ones. In shades, the focal points are colored to diminish light transmission and keep away from glare. Initially, focal points were made of straightforward quartz and beryl, yet expanded interest prompted the reception of optical glass, for which Venice and Nuremberg were the main places of creation. Ernst Abbe and Otto Schott in 1885 exhibited that the fuse of new components into the glass dissolve prompted numerous advantageous varieties in refractive record and dispersive force. In the cutting-edge measure, glass for focal points is first moved into plate structure. Most focal points are produced using clear crown glass of refractive list 1. 523. In high nearsighted remedies, a restorative improvement is effected if the focal points are made of thick stone glass, refractive list 1. 69, and covered with a film of magnesium fluoride to invalidate the surface reflections. Rock glass, or barium crown, which has less dispersive force, is utilized in intertwined bifocals. In shades, the focal points are colored to lessen light transmission and keep away from glare. Advances in terminal advances and gadget materials have decreased the danger of contamination related with cochlear inserts. Also, decreases in the measures of outer parts have given more up-to-date gadgets a generally careful appearance, albeit in small kids the amplifier and transmitter are frequently prominent. Regardless of these immense upgrades in cochlear embed innovation, be that as it may, the drawn-out impacts of the terminals on the nerves and capacity of the hear-able core stay obscure. Preventive medication. Endeavors coordinated toward the avoidance of infection, either locally overall, a significant piece of what is comprehensively named general well-being, or in the person. Hippocrates, the Greek doctor of the 5th century BC, arranged reasons for infection into those worried about seasons, environments, and outside conditions, and those more close to home causes like unpredictable food, exercise, and propensities for the person. Through the Middle Ages, the standards of preventive medication were disregarded, regardless of the scourges of uncleanliness and plague. With the Renaissance came the new discovering that upset the entire substance of medication. Experts again noticed the connection of the seasons, natural conditions, and individual contact to the frequency of infection. Simultaneous with the development of clinical information, there was an observational development of common sense avoidance. For instance, in 1388 there was passed the main sterile demonstration in England, coordinated to the expulsion of annoyances. In 1443 came the primary plague request suggesting isolate and purifying, and in 1518 the principal unpleasant endeavours at notice of pandemic infection and detachment of the investigation of mortality insights was started in England in the 17th century. The premise of the study of disease transmission was laid during the 17th century. In 1700 a composition on word-related problems was distributed in Italy. An English expert in the principal half of the 18th century composed on harms, on plague and techniques for its anticipation, and on smallpox, measles, and scurvy. Inoculation was presented in 1798. The early and center-long stretches of the 19th century were remarkable for revelations in the transmission of infectious sicknesses like typhus, cholera, typhoid fever, and childbed puerperal fever. In a similar period expanding consideration was given to issues of cleanliness and nourishment. The advanced time in preventive medication opened during the 19th century with Louis Pasteur's revelation of the job of living microorganisms as the reason for contaminations. At the end of the century the standard of creepy crawly-borne transmission of infection was set up. Serological tests were grown, for example, the Weidel response for typhoid fever 1896, and the Wassermann test for syphilis 1906. A comprehension of the standards of invulnerability prompted the advancement of dynamic vaccination to explicit infections. Equal advances in treatment opened different entryways for avoidance, in diphtheria by serum and in syphilis by arsphenamine. In 1932 the sulfonamide drugs and later the antitoxins including penicillin, streptomycin, chlortetracycline, and chloramphenicol managed the cost of new chances of avoidance and fix of bacterial sicknesses. After 1900 there were many advances in preventive medication other than those identified with irresistible infections. The utilization of X-beams and radioactive substances in the finding and therapy of illness, e.g., tuberculosis and disease, just as in principal physiological exploration opened additional opportunities. A more prominent comprehension of endocrine capacities, with the creation of arranged chemical concentrates like insulin, prompted preventive measures in certain metabolic illnesses. The job of nourishment in well-being and illness and the disconnection of numerous fundamental food factors showed the significance to soundness of sufficient eating routine. Other 20th century propels in preventive medication remembered a more extensive acknowledgement of mental elements for connection to add up to well-being, new careful procedures, new strategies for sedation, and hereditary qualities research. Restoration robot. Any consequently worked machine that is intended to further development in people with debilitated actual working. There are two primary kinds of restoration robots. The primary kind is an assistive robot that substitutes for lost appendage developments. A model is the Manus arm, assistive automated controller, which is a wheelchair-mounted mechanical arm that is controlled utilizing a jawline switch or other information gadget. That interaction is called telemanipulation and is like a space traveler's controlling a rocket's robot arm from inside the space apparatus cockpit. Controlled wheelchairs are another illustration of teleoperated, assistive robots. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Life is Often if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.